April 10th, 1221. Nishapur, Persia. Dawn. Governor Atam Alik Juvani stood on the eastern wall and watched 70,000 horsemen arrange themselves into perfect geometric formations across the plain. The Mongols had arrived 3 hours before sunrise, materializing out of the darkness like something summoned, and now as the sun climbed, they were organizing themselves with a precision that made his throat tight. He was 41 years old, a career administrator, who had governed this city for 6 years, and he understood with absolute clarity that he was looking at his own death. The only question was what form that death would take. Below him, inside Nishapur's massive walls, 200,000 people went about their morning routines with forced normalcy. Market vendors set up stalls. Mothers prepared breakfast. Artisans opened workshops. The call to prayer echoed from 100 minarets. Everyone knew the Mongols were outside. Everyone knew what was coming. But the human mind has remarkable capacity for denial when the alternative is confronting its own extinction. Nishapur was one of the great cities of the Islamic world, capital of Khorasan province, jewel of the Silk Road, home to poets and astronomers and mathematicians whose works were studied from Spain to China. Its walls, 40 feet high and thick enough that 2 wagons could pass atop them, had never been breached. The city had survived earthquakes, droughts, dynastic upheavals. It had endured for over 1,000 years. Surely, the people told themselves, surely these walls would hold against nomads from the steppe. What they didn't know, what Governor Juvani couldn't bring himself to tell them, was that the army outside wasn't just any Mongol force. This was the Tumans of Tuluhi Khan, youngest son of Genghis Khan himself, operating under explicit orders from the Great Khan to erase Nishapur from the earth. This wasn't a siege, it was an execution that hadn't happened yet. The sentence had been passed 8 months earlier, in a different siege, at a different city, and it had nothing to do with Nishapur's strategic importance or wealth, or anything remotely rational. It had to do with an arrow and a man's death, and a grieving widow who demanded revenge on a scale that would shock the medieval world. To understand why Nishapur was about to die, you have to understand what the Khwarezmian Empire did to provoke Genghis Khan's invasion of Persia in the first place. In 1218, the Mongol Empire and the Khwarezmian Shah, Alauddin Muhammad, had been at peace. Genghis, having conquered northern China and subdued the steppe tribes, sent a trade caravan of 450 merchants to Khwarezm bearing gold, silk, jade, and a letter proposing commercial relations. It was standard Mongol practice, trade or conquest, your choice, but one way or another Genghis would have what he wanted. The governor of Ortra, a Khwarezmian border city, decided the merchants were spies. He seized the caravan and executed every single merchant. When Genghis sent ambassadors to demand explanation and restitution, Shah Muhammad had them killed as well, sending one back to Mongolia with his beard burned off as an insult. This was a miscalculation of staggering proportions. Genghis Khan was 60 years old, master of the largest contiguous land empire in history, a man who had spent his entire life turning resistance into object lessons. You didn't kill his merchants. You didn't murder his ambassadors. You especially didn't humiliate him publicly and expect to survive. In 1219, Genghis mobilized 200,000 of his finest troops, roughly 20% of the entire Mongol military, and rode west with the explicit intention of destroying the Khwarezmian Empire so completely that it would never threaten him again. The campaign was systematic devastation. City after city fell: Ortra, Bukhara, Samarkand, each one subjected to the Mongol method: surrender immediately, and you might survive as a tributary; resist, and everyone dies. The Mongol siege tactics were revolutionary for the 13th century, combining Chinese engineering expertise with steppe mobility. They had catapults that could throw projectiles weighing 300 pounds over walls. They had siege towers, battering rams, incendiary weapons. More importantly, they had engineers who understood counterweight trebuchets, the cutting-edge artillery of the medieval world, capable of hurling stones or burning pitch with devastating accuracy. But the real Mongol weapon wasn't technology. It was terror. Genghis understood that if you made resistance sufficiently horrifying, cities would surrender without a fight, saving you the time and casualties of a siege. So, when cities did resist, the Mongols made examples. They would slaughter the entire population, pile the skulls in pyramids, and leave the ruins as warnings to the next city. It was psychological warfare refined to an art form, and it worked. By 1220, most of Western Khwarezm was paying tribute without ever seeing a Mongol soldier. Nishapur, however, had other ideas. The city was governed by a complex hierarchy. The local rulers, the religious authorities, the merchant councils, all of whom were confident their walls would hold. More importantly, Nishapur had pride. This was a city that had hosted Omar Khayyam, whose observatories had calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of modern measurements. These were civilized people. They weren't going to prostrate themselves before illiterate horsemen from Mongolia. In August 1220, a Mongol force under Tokachi, son-in-law of Genghis Khan and married to his favorite daughter, Alakai Beki, arrived outside Nishapur and demanded surrender. The city refused. The siege began. It was a relatively standard affair by Mongol standards. Artillery bombardment, attempts to undermine the walls, skirmishing. Tokachi was confident. He'd taken fortified cities before. Nishapur would fall like all the others. Then, on the third day of the siege, an arrow came from Nishapur's walls. Persian composite bow, probably shot by a defender who'd never know what he'd just done. It caught Tokachi in the throat, severing his carotid artery. He was dead before his officers could reach him. The Mongols withdrew. This wasn't cowardice. It was procedure. When a Khan's son-in-law dies, you pull back, regroup, send word to the Great Khan, and wait for orders. Tokachi's body was preserved and sent back to Mongolia, where Genghis Khan received it in the presence of his entire family. Alakai Beki, the daughter who had just lost her husband, stood before her father and made a request that would doom 200,000 people when Nishapur fell, and it would fall. No living thing inside the walls should be spared. Not men, not women, not children, not animals. The city itself should be obliterated, ploughed under like a field, salted so nothing would ever grow there again. Genghis granted her request. The orders went to Tulu Khan: take Nishapur, leave nothing alive. That was 8 months ago. Now, in April 1221, Tolua had arrived with 70,000 veterans, 3,000 Chinese siege engineers, and explicit instructions for total annihilation. He also brought something else. Alakai Beki herself. The widowed princess had ridden with the army, determined to watch Nishapur die. She would personally oversee the massacre that followed the city's fall. This wasn't strategy. This was revenge dressed in military authority. The siege began with a bombardment that shook the earth. Mongol trebuchets, 40 of them, positioned at intervals around the city's perimeter, started hurling stones at dawn on April 10th. These weren't crude catapults. They were precision instruments designed by Chinese engineers who'd spent generations perfecting the mathematics of counterweight projectiles. Each stone weighed between 200 and 300 pounds. They struck Nishapur's walls with impacts that could be felt in the city's center. The sound was apocalyptic, a continuous thunder punctuated by the crash of stone on stone. Governor Juvayni organized the defense as best he could. Nishapur's garrison numbered perhaps 15,000 men, a mix of regular soldiers, city guard, and armed civilians. They had adequate supplies for a long siege, plenty of ammunition for their archers, and good morale despite the impossible odds. The walls were formidable, the best defensive architecture of the age. If they could hold out long enough, perhaps relief would come. Perhaps the Mongols would get bored and move on. Perhaps a miracle would happen. None of those things would happen. The Mongol assault was methodical and relentless. While the trebuchets pounded the walls, Mongol cavalry circled the city in rotating shifts, ensuring no one got out, no messages got through. Other detachments ranged across the surrounding countryside, destroying every village, every farm, every source of potential aid. Nishapur was being isolated, cut off from the world, left alone with its walls and its hope, and the army that was systematically demolishing both. By the third day, sections of the eastern wall were showing cracks. The trebuchets had found their range, concentrating fire on specific points, fracturing the stone through repeated impacts. Mongol engineers moved closer under cover of night, driving tunnels toward the wall foundations. This was siege warfare at its most sophisticated, multiple simultaneous approaches, each one designed to stretch the defenders thin, force them to respond in multiple directions at once. Inside the city, reality was setting in. The market districts emptied as people huddled in their homes. The wealthy began offering massive bribes to anyone who could get them out. There were no takers. Religious authorities led prayers for deliverance that rang increasingly hollow as the wall sections crumbled. Parents tried to comfort children who cried at the continuous thunder of the bombardment. Everyone knew what happened to cities that resisted the Mongols. Everyone had heard the stories from Bukhara, from Samarkand, but knowing and accepting are different things, and Nishapur hadn't yet crossed that threshold. On April 13th, a section of the eastern wall collapsed. Not the whole wall, just a 30-foot segment where the Mongol trebuchets had been concentrating their fire. It came down in the afternoon, a roar of falling stone followed by a cloud of dust that hung over the city like a shroud. The Mongol bombardment immediately intensified on the adjacent sections, trying to widen the breach. Inside, Nishapur's defenders rushed to build secondary barriers, piling rubble and timbers to create a makeshift inner wall. The first Mongol assault came that evening. Not the full army, just a probing attack. Perhaps 2,000 horsemen riding straight for the breach, testing the defense, seeing how the city would respond. They were met with a storm of arrows from the walls, and positioned archers behind the rubble. The Mongols pulled back after a brief engagement, having lost perhaps 50 men while learning exactly what they needed to know about Nishapur's defensive capabilities at the breach point. The second assault came at dawn on April 14th, and this time it was serious. 10,000 Mongol warriors, dismounted and formed into assault columns, advanced on the breach behind a rolling barrage from the trebuchets. They carried scaling ladders, grappling hooks, and bundles of arrows. Behind them came Chinese engineers with specialized equipment, incendiary pots, smoke bombs, and the dreaded Mongol fire lances, primitive flamethrowers that sprayed burning naphtha. The fighting at the breach was apocalyptic. Nishapur's defenders, knowing this was existential, fought with desperate courage. They poured boiling oil from above, dropped stones, shot arrows until their fingers bled and their quivers were empty. The Mongols came on anyway, climbing over their own dead, pushing into the breach with methodical determination. For 6 hours the battle raged at that single point, men dying in heaps, the rubble pile growing slick with blood. Then the Mongols pulled back, not defeated, just rotating units. Fresh warriors replaced the exhausted assault troops while the defenders, who had no reserves, stayed at their posts and tried not to collapse from exhaustion. An hour later the Mongols attacked again, and again, and again. It was a tactic they'd perfected over decades, relentless pressure, rotating forces, never giving the enemy time to rest or regroup. Break them physically, break them mentally, and when they finally crack the city falls all at once. Nishapur's crack came on the evening of April 14th. A Mongol mine tunnel reached the foundation beneath a wall tower north of the main breach. The engineers packed it with gunpowder, a Chinese innovation that the Mongols had adopted with devastating effectiveness, and detonated it. The explosion brought down 60 feet of wall, and the tower with it. Suddenly there were 2 breaches, too far apart for the defenders to support both simultaneously. The Mongols poured through both gaps. By nightfall they controlled sections of the eastern quarter. Nishapur's defenders fell back to secondary positions, building barricades at intersections, turning the city into a labyrinth of kill zones. The fighting devolved into brutal urban combat, hand-to-hand in narrow streets, ambushes from rooftops. Fires started deliberately to deny quarters to the attackers, but the momentum had shifted. Everyone knew it. The walls had failed. Now it was just a question of how long the dying would take. Governor Giovanni, from his position in the central citadel, could see the fires spreading through the eastern quarter. He could hear the screams, the clash of weapons, the inhuman sounds of a city being conquered. Around him, his advisors were arguing about surrender, about negotiating terms, about whether there was still a chance to save some portion of the population. Giovanni knew better. He'd seen the Mongol encampment, seen the black banner flying beside Tolu's command tent, the banner that meant no quarter, no mercy, no survivors. And he'd heard the rumors about Alakai Beki, about the princess widow who rode with the army, and who had personally promised to oversee Nishapur's obliteration. The fighting continued through the night, and into April 15th. The Mongols advanced block by block, quarter by quarter, compressing the defenders into an ever-shrinking area around the citadel. Some civilians tried to flee to the countryside. They were hunted down by Mongol cavalry patrols and killed in the fields. Others hid in cellars and cisterns, hoping to wait out the slaughter. A few tried to surrender, offering gold and jewels. The Mongols took everything and killed them anyway. By evening on April 15th, only the central citadel still held out, perhaps 5,000 defenders, maybe 10,000 civilians, packed into the fortified administrative complex at Nishapur's heart. Around them, most of the city was already burning. The fires started by both defenders trying to slow the Mongol advance, and Mongols who had decided it was easier to burn occupied buildings than clear them room by room. Tolu offered final terms. Surrender now, immediately, and the garrison would be spared to serve as slaves. Refuse, and everyone dies. It was probably a lie. The orders from Genghis had been explicit, but it was the last gesture toward mercy that would be offered. Nishapur's defenders refused, not because they believed they could still win, not because they thought relief was coming. They refused because at some point during those 6 days of hell, the city had collectively decided that death with defiance was preferable to whatever the Mongols had planned for survivors. It was a choice born of desperation and pride, and the knowledge that either way they were already dead. The final assault came at dawn on April 16th. The Mongols brought up their remaining trebuchets and literally demolished the citadel's walls stone by stone. Then they flooded in, 10,000 warriors against perhaps 2,000 surviving defenders, who could barely hold their weapons. The fighting lasted less than an hour. It was massacre, not battle. The defenders died where they stood, fighting to the last, and when it was over the citadel was a mountain of corpses. What happened next would become legend, whispered about in horror across the Islamic world for generations. Alakai Beki entered Nishapur on April 16th, riding through streets carpeted with bodies. She toured the ruins, verified that resistance was ended, and then gave her orders. Every living thing in the city was to be killed. Not just the defenders, not just the men, every person, regardless of age or gender. The work would be done systematically, with counts kept to ensure completeness. And when the killing was done, Nishapur's walls would be demolished, the buildings leveled, and the site ploughed under. The Mongol soldiers, veterans of a dozen campaigns who had seen and done terrible things, were reportedly shocked. This wasn't military necessity. This wasn't even typical Mongol terror tactics. This was something darker, personalized vengeance carried to its logical extreme. But orders were orders, and Alakai Beki had the authority of Genghis Khan behind her demands. The massacre took 3 days. Mongol soldiers went building by building, cellar by cellar, pulling out anyone who had survived the siege and killing them. The methods varied: swords, arrows, clubbing, but the result was the same. Historical accounts, written by Persian historians who interviewed survivors from other cities, claim that the dead were organized by gender and counted. The totals reported were staggering: 700,000 killed, though modern historians consider this number inflated. The actual death toll was probably between 150,000 and 200,000, still one of the largest urban massacres in human history. The numbers alone don't capture the horror. Entire families were executed together. Children were killed in front of their parents. The elderly, the sick, the injured, no one was spared. The Mongols even killed the city's cats and dogs. Following Alakai Beki's orders, literally, when it was done, Nishapur was silent. Not peaceful, silent in the way only death is silent, broken only by the wind moving through ruins and the cries of carrion birds. Then came the demolition. Mongol engineers, the same ones who had designed the siege works, now applied their skills to destruction. They systematically knocked down every structure, leveled every wall, filled in every cellar. The rubble was spread across the site. Some accounts claim they literally plowed the ground and sowed it with salt, though this detail is disputed. What's certain is that when the Mongols left, Nishapur no longer existed as a functioning city. It was a field of rubble covering hundreds of thousands of dead. The psychological impact rippled across Persia and beyond. Cities that had been considering resistance immediately surrendered when word reached them. The Mongol reputation for mercilessness, already formidable, became absolute. Genghis Khan's strategy of using terror as a weapon had worked perfectly, by making an example of Nishapur so extreme that it defied comprehension. He ensured that future conquests would cost fewer Mongol lives. From a purely military standpoint, it was brilliant. From a human standpoint, it was monstrous. The Khwarezmian Empire never recovered. Shah Muhammad had died on the run the previous year, his empire shattered, his cities destroyed or subjugated. His son Jalal ad-Din would continue guerrilla resistance for another decade, but the centralized state was finished. The Mongols had accomplished their objective. The power that had dared to kill Mongol merchants and ambassadors had been erased from history. Genghis Khan received reports of Nishapur's destruction in his camp near Samarkand. He approved of Tolu's thoroughness, commended his son's efficiency, and moved on to planning the next campaign. For the great Khan, Nishapur was a solved problem, a message successfully delivered. That 200,000 people had died to deliver that message was simply the cost of maintaining the empire's reputation. Tului Khan would go on to become one of the most successful Mongol commanders, leading campaigns in China and Europe. He died in 1232, probably from alcohol poisoning, having spent his life conquering in his father's name. His sons would become the great Khans Mönki and Kublai, rulers of the largest land empire in history. Nishapur was a footnote in his military career, one siege among dozens. Alakai Beki returned to Mongolia, having achieved her revenge. Historical records say little about her subsequent life, noting only that she remained influential in Mongol politics for decades. Whether she ever expressed regret for what she'd ordered at Nishapur is unknown, probably not. In the 13th century, vengeance was considered a virtue, and she'd avenged her husband in the most complete way possible. Nishapur itself would eventually be rebuilt, decades later, but it never regained its former glory. The new city was constructed some distance from the original site, as if the very ground where the massacre occurred was cursed. Modern Nishapur is a modest Iranian city of 250,000 people, its ancient past commemorated by archaeological sites and monuments. Walk through the ruins of the old city, and you'll find traces, fragments of wall, scattered foundations, and everywhere, layers of ash and bone worked into the earth. The siege became a parable, a cautionary tale told across the Islamic world. It appeared in histories, in poetry, in oral traditions. The message was always the same. This is what happens when you defy the Mongols. This is what resistance costs. Better to surrender, to pay tribute, to survive than to choose pride and die. It was psychological warfare that echoed for generations, shaping how later peoples responded to Mongol expansion. Modern historians debate the strategic necessity of Nishapur's destruction. Some argue it was effective terrorism that saved Mongol lives in subsequent campaigns. Others see it as excessive even by medieval standards, a crime that served no military purpose beyond satisfying one woman's grief. Both perspectives are probably correct. War in the 13th century was brutality systematized, and the Mongols were simply better at it than anyone else. They turned massacre into policy, terror into tactics, and examples like Nishapur into the foundation of an empire. The death toll at Nishapur remains one of the highest for any pre-modern siege. Only the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 would exceed it in absolute numbers. But Baghdad was a metropolis, the intellectual capital of the Islamic world, whose fall marked a historical turning point. Nishapur was, by comparison, a regional city whose destruction changed nothing strategically. It died because an arrow killed the wrong man, and his wife demanded revenge on a scale that shocked even the Mongols. That's perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the whole episode. This wasn't military necessity. This wasn't strategic calculation. This was personal. 200,000 people died because one woman's grief was backed by the military might of the most powerful empire on earth, and no one could or would tell her no. In the end, Nishapur chose death over surrender, not because death was preferable, but because surrender offered nothing better. When the alternative is slavery or massacre anyway, you might as well die on your feet. The siege lasted 6 days. The massacre took 3 more, and when it was over, Nishapur had been erased so completely that for years afterward, travelers passing through the region had difficulty finding where the city had stood. The walls that had never been breached in 1,000 years fell in less than a week. The population that had refused to bow to nomadic horsemen was exterminated to the last person, and the lesson was written in blood and rubble and 100,000 skulls piled in pyramids outside the ruins. Do not resist the Mongols, ever, for any reason. Because resistance doesn't lead to defeat, it leads to extinction. Governor Artamalik Juvayni died in the final assault on the citadel, sword in hand. Having chosen to fight rather than watch his city die, his body was never identified from among the thousands. Nishapur died with him, and the world learned once again that empires are built on more than just military superiority. They're built on fear, and sometimes, they're built on mountains of the dead.